I chose to read Safe Haven by Nicholas Sparks. The reason I chose this was because I love Nicholas Sparks and all of his books. I think I've read almost all of them, but Safe Haven's a movie too, so that was really good actually, but the book is better. So if you've seen the movie but haven't read the book, you should read it. As Katie shopped, Alex fiddled around the register, watching her from the corner of his eye. He straightened the counter, checked on Josh, examined Kristen's picture, and straightened the counter again, doing his best to seem busy. She'd changed in recent weeks. She had the beginnings of a summer tan, and her skin had a glowing freshness to it. She was also growing less skittish around him, today being a prime example. No, they hadn't set the world on fire with their scintillating conversation, but it was a start, right? But the start of what? From the very beginning, he'd sensed she was in trouble, and his instinctive response had been to want to help. And of course she was pretty, despite the bad haircut and plain Jane attire. But it was seeing the way Katie had comforted Kristen, and after Josh had fallen in the water, that had really moved him. Even more affecting had been Kristen's response to Katie. She had reached for Katie like a child reaching for her mother. It had made his throat tighten, reminding him that as much as he missed having a wife, his children missed having a mother. He knew they were grieving, and he tried to make up for it as best he could, but it wasn't until he saw Katie and Kristen together that he realized the sadness was only part of what they were experiencing. Their loneliness mirrored his own. It troubled him that he hadn't realized it before. As for Katie, she was something of a mystery to him. There was a missing element somewhere, something that had been gnawing at him. He watched her, wondering who she really was and what had brought her to Southport. She was standing near one of the refrigerator cases, something she'd never done before, studying the items behind the glass. She frowned, and as she was debating what to buy, he noticed the fingers of her right hand twisting around her left ring finger, toying with a ring that wasn't there. The gesture triggered something both familiar and long forgotten. It was a habit, a tic he noticed during his years at CID, and sometimes observed with women whose faces were bruised and disfigured. They used to sit across from him, compulsively touching their rings, as though they were shackles that bound them to their husbands. Usually they denied that their husband had hit them, and in the rare instances they admitted the truth. They usually insisted it wasn't his fault, that they provoked him. They'd tell him that they burned dinner, or hadn't done the wash, or that he'd been drinking. And always, these same women would swear that it was the first time it had ever happened, and tell him that they didn't want to press charges because his career would be ruined. Everyone knew the Army came down hard on abusive husbands. Some were different, though, at least in the beginning, and insisted that they wanted to press charges. He would start the report and listen as they questioned why paperwork was more important than making an arrest, than enforcing the law. He would write up the report anyway and read their own words back to them before asking them to sign it. It was then sometimes that their bravado would fail, and he'd catch a glimpse of the terrified woman beneath the angry surface. Many would end up not signing it, and even those who did would quickly change their minds when their husbands were brought in. Those cases went forward no matter what the woman decided, but later when a wife wouldn't testify, little punishment was meted out. Alex came to understand that only those who pressed charges ever became truly free, because the life they were leading was a prison, even if most of them wouldn't admit it. Still, there was another way to escape the horror of their lives, though in all his years he'd come across only one who actually did it. He'd interviewed the woman once, and she'd taken the usual route of denial and self-blame, but a couple of months later he'd learned that she'd fled. Not to her family and not to her friends, but somewhere else, a place where even her husband couldn't find her. Her husband, lost in his fury that his wife had left, had exploded after a long night of drinking and had bloodied an MP. He ended up in Leavenworth, and Alex remembered grinning in satisfaction when he'd heard the news. And when thinking of the man's wife, he smiled, thinking, "Good for you." Now as he watched Katie toying with a ring that wasn't there, he felt his old investigative instincts kick in. There had been a husband, he thought. Her husband was the missing element. Either she was still married or she wasn't. But he had an undeniable hunch that Katie was still afraid of him.